Hi there, welcome back. It's Jennifer, and today I have for you a bunch of cards, all featuring different ways to use embossing folders. I've done many videos on techniques for embossing folders, and I will link to the playlist of those videos up here on the top right and in my description below. Today I'm focusing on 3D embossing folders, which give you a lot of dimension. I am using products from the new Simon Says Stamptember release, and in that release, there were many 3D embossing folders. But keep in mind, you can do these with traditional embossing folders also, or others that you may have on hand. There are a few reasons that I reach for embossing folders so often. One is that they are really versatile. You can use them for a lot of different techniques. Two, they're easy to use. And three, they're pretty affordable, considering all the different options that are out there. Let's get started with this example. This card uses the new Simon Says Stamp Crimped Floral Embossing Folder and the dies that come with it. These dies cut out some of those flowers so you can use them as accents. I have a piece of cardstock that I've misted with water and I'm putting into that embossing folder. I'm using my Empress die cut machine to use this 3D embossing folder. The sandwich I use with that machine is one cutting plate, the embossing folder, and then the metal shim. You can find a sandwich that works with these embossing folders no matter what die cut machine you have. After I run that through the die cut machine, I like to heat set it to dry that water before I move on to anything else. The reason I mist the paper is it gives a better impression and prevents cracking. Now I want to add some ink to those flowers. I have my Positively Perfect Craft Tacky mat inside of my Misty stamping tool. I just keep it there because it's the right size, but really it's just holding that paper in place as I add ink. Any sticky mat would work. I also have my Altenew micro blending brushes. These are tiny brushes that are great for applying ink in tiny areas. I'm using Rainbow Splash ink. The first color I'm using is Lake, and that happens to be the same color as the cardstock I used, Rainbow Splash Lake cardstock, and I'll link to those below. I really like these blues, and they match really well with the sea color, which I'll show you in a bit. I'm using the micro blending brushes to apply a blue color at the center of the flowers. I start with the micro brush right at the center of the flower and work my way around into bigger circles to blend that ink out kind of towards the tip of the flowers. So this will give the darker color towards the center. Now you could take greater care to get a better blend, but I find this works it's good enough, right? And I find that these inks kind of blend in on their own as they dry and absorb into the paper, so you'll get a smooth look. So I continued to do that for all of the flowers. And then for the bigger flowers, I'm coming in with the smaller of the micro brush and the slightly darker sea color of ink from Rainbow Splash. And I'm putting that right at the center only of the bigger flowers. Once I'm done with that, I'll use the Hero Arts Unicorn White Pigment Ink. You can use any white pigment ink. And a Tim Holtz brayer to lightly roll white pigment ink on the raised areas. So just the most raised areas of these flowers will grab that white ink and give a nice highlight. Now, I don't want this to be too vibrant, so I'm taking a cloth and removing a little bit of that white ink just to soften it so we end up with a gorgeous result. So with this technique, I added some ink, some dye ink, darker colored dye ink to some of the deeper areas of the flowers. And then I put a white highlight on some of the higher areas of the flowers. And look at how that enhances the pattern. For a sentiment, I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Fancy Just Because die set. Now, the cardstock I used the embossing folder on is Rainbow Splash Lake. Now, the slightly darker color that I have over on the right is Rainbow Splash Sea. They go together wonderfully. So I used the sea color cardstock for the shadow die cut of Just Because, and then I used white for the words themselves. We can start to put our card together. To add that embossing foldered background onto my note card, I'm using a piece of Altenew double-sided adhesive sheet. I find this is the best type of adhesive when wanting to add texture to a card, or you could use liquid adhesive that you really spread out all over the whole background. But I find the double-sided adhesive sheet to be better. I added that all onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. Next, I use the dies that come with this embossing folder to cut white die cuts, and I'm lining them up inside of the embossing folder. Now, all you have to do is put them on the side of the embossing folder where the flowers are indented, and the die cuts kind of sit into that indentation. And that way you know it's lined up. Once you have them lined up, you carefully close the embossing folder, run it through your die cut machine, and it'll put that texture on your die cuts, giving you three-dimensional looking die cuts. I love doing this, and I love that Simon Says Stamp has so many embossing folders with coordinating dies. Now, on those white die cuts, I'm adding some of the same inks onto them, but leaving the tips of the die cuts white so they stand out against the blue background. I originally thought I was going to do blue flowers. You can see them laying there on my desk on the left, but I changed my mind to do the white so that they would stand out. And by the way, Rainbow Splash is a line from Simon Says Stamp, and they have a lot of great ink colors and great cardstock colors to match. So at this point, I have lots of pieces and I can put my card together. And this is where I started overthinking. Now, it really is best to just create and let things flow. But many people, like me, are overthinkers. I overthink everything in life. I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's something that I'm working on. But I do overthink my cards sometimes. Here, I can't decide between the white flowers and blue flowers, or if I should put my sentiment straight or at an angle. Do know if you overthink, it's okay. And do know if you just like to let it go and see what happens, that's okay too. Everybody creates different. This particular day, I was struggling a bit with putting all of my cards together. You'll see me struggle later on too, and that's okay. I stuck with it, ended up with cards in the end that I think recipients will like. So if you're an overthinker, don't worry. You can still create and have fun. So here's my completed card. I did decide to use the white flowers with the blue ink in the center. And I used a darker blue marker to add just a touch of really dark blue at the center of each of the flowers in the background. And finally, I used a Simon Says Stamp sparkling gemstone. I love those dazzling gemstones. They have a lot of sparkle to them with no color, so they work on any card. Now, I really loved making this card, and I loved the result of it. So I plan to do a rainbow of these cards and put them together in a card set and give them to Lila's principal because I've discovered she is incredible. Let's move on to my second card. This uses one embossing folder in two different ways, and then I piece them together to create a bold, colorful background. Now for this card, I'm using two colors of cardstock. I have Simon Says Stamp Doll Pink, which is on the left, and then the darker is Concord and Ninth Wildberry. I'm putting it into the Simon Says Stamp Thread Plaid embossing folder. This is a 3D embossing folder. For their embossing folders and the Impress die cut machine, I use one cutting plate, the 3D folder, and then a metal shim. Do know that you can use these 3D embossing folders with whatever machine you have. You'll just have to experiment with what sandwich is best. And look at the results of this. You can see what looks like the threads in this plaid pattern, such detail, and you really can only get that with the 3D embossing folder. Now you could leave this as is, but I'm going to add ink to it, and I'm going to show the difference between the two sides. So I'm laying this down onto my tacky mat just to hold it in place, and this is how the embossing folder is really meant to be, with the plaid area being raised. I'm using Hero Arts Core ink here simply because I like the color Raspberry Jam on this Wildberry cardstock from Concord and Ninth. I'm using a Tim Holtz brayer and lightly rolling that ink over the raised areas. And that makes the plaid stand out even more. You can use any inks really for that technique. Now, I do want to mention that any kind of sticky mat, including this tacky mat, will stain with some inks. That's just the nature of the product. I do like to use Hero Arts Ultra Clean and their scrubber to clean off as much of the ink as I can right away, especially when using reds or blues. And that takes off most of the color and allows you to get it back to a pretty clear look. All right, so let's take a closer look at the background we have. So it's that Wildberry cardstock, and then all of the raised areas, the pattern has that darker color. It just is a great way to make the pattern stand out even more. Now let's flip it over for a comparison and apply ink to the other side. In this case, the background of the plaid is raised and the plaid pattern itself is indented. So when I roll ink over it, the background grabs the color. So it gives kind of the opposite look as the other side. So I'll flip it here so you can see the two different looks. So remember, you can use either side of your embossing folder, add some ink to it, and change how it looks. Now let's take the Simon Says Stamp Doll Pink cardstock and just use a little bit of adhesive to hold that cardstock into the embossing folder. Now on the top side of the embossing folder, I am applying the Unicorn White Pigment ink from Hero Arts. Any white pigment ink would work here. You can either swipe the ink over it or dab it on. Just don't do so very firmly because you don't want the ink to get into the indentations, only on the raised area. I'll then close that, run it through my die cut machine to make an impression, and then repeat the process. The key to this technique is repeating the process a few times to apply more and more ink so you get an even look. By the way, you could instead do this with the colored ink. After doing the white ink, look at how the background is softer than the raised areas, allowing that plaid to stand out even more. And here's a piece of that cardstock from what it looked like before. And then when we added the white, it lightened it. Now, if you want the plaid to stand out even more, you can add ink to the raised areas, just like we did on the other piece over to the left. This time I'm using Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated Sweets ink. This is a great bright pink. And I'm carefully rolling this ink just on the raised areas. So I'm being gentle so that those raised areas are a bit darker. So really you can press ink into the pattern by putting ink in the embossing folder, or you can put ink on the raised areas by using a brayer on it after you've done the embossing. So two different looks from one embossing folder. Now let's put those together on a card using one of my favorite new Simon Says Stamp die sets. This is the Autumn Leaf Frame die set. The reason I like this set is because it creates 3 different frames that can be used together or separately. And it has 3 word dies in it that you can use with these or with other products. So I die cut the frame from white cardstock, and I'm gluing 2 of the outermost frame together. This has a lot of detail to it, and I'm gluing that directly onto our darker plaid background. Because I'm gluing this onto a textured background, I'll put something heavy on it while it dries and come back to it in a moment. Next, I have a white note card that's 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I'm putting double-sided adhesive sheet on it, and then I will add my lighter pink background that's trimmed to be a little bit smaller than 4 1/4 by 5.5. Now this frame should be dry, so I'm using my scissors to cut the excess of that plaid background off so that it's only inside of the frame and showing through those little holes on the frame itself. I then can put some double-sided adhesive tape on the back of this to add to the card. Again, I use the double-sided adhesive because I know that will really adhere all that texture together. Now, instead of measuring what size piece I need, I'm just putting this double-sided adhesive sheet piece up close to the corner and putting a mark at the 2 spots I need to cut so that it'll be the right size to be slightly smaller than that piece. So that's a little trick. You could measure, but why do math when you don't have to, right? So now this is the right size. I can put it on the back of that frame piece and then add it to our card. So we have 2 backgrounds made with the same embossing folder, but they have a different feel to them. And when I glue them together, it'll continue that pattern because I'm going to put this darker piece right at the center of the lighter piece so that plaid will be continuous from the background to that area in the center. I just love that look. Next, I'm using the second of the frame die cuts that the Autumn Leaf Frame die set makes. It's a thin frame, just a rectangle frame. And I cut that from silver matte cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. I used some liquid adhesive right inside of the white die cut, and now I'm pressing the silver die cut in there. I thought that pop of silver helps to make everything stand out, but you could have skipped this frame if you wanted to. Now for the third frame that this die set makes, it's this thin white frame die cut that has the floral images at the bottom. I'm putting liquid adhesive on the back of that and gluing that right in the center. By the way, both of the white frame die cuts are 2 die cuts thick. I die cut 2, glued them together for a bit of dimension, but the silver is only 1. Now for sentiment on this, I'm using the Thanks sentiment from the same autumn leaf frame die set. It has hugs, hello, and thanks. I chose to do thanks with silver cardstock, and I added that a little bit of a diagonal for something different and fun. Now you could add embellishments to this, but I thought it was good enough as is because you have that plaid texture in the background. And we used 2 different techniques with that plaid embossing folder to get 2 different looks. But because we put them together, we have that continuous plaid over the whole card. So this just shows you more ways of adding ink to your embossing folder backgrounds. All right, let's move on to this technique. This is one I haven't shown in a video in quite some time, so I'm excited to share it today. It's a technique that I used on the background. For this, I'm using the new Simon Says Stamp Holly Bunch embossing folder, and it comes with a die. Now let's use the embossing folder alone first. I am using a piece of craft cardstock. This is Nina Desert Storm Craft cardstock. I get mine at Simon Says Stamp. It's a nice light colored craft and it's heavyweight. And look at that beautiful impression you get with the embossing folder. Now I'm going to flip that over. So when I flip it over, it will have the holly kind of indented down. So the background is raised up towards the camera. On it, I'm placing a Simon Says Stamp background stamp, the hand-lettered background stamp, and I'm inking it up with white pigment ink. And I'm stamping that lightly onto the background. What will happen is the stamping only hits that raised background, not the indentations of the holly pattern. So you get a really cool look simply by stamping on that raised area. Now, I wanted to step that up a bit. I completely heat set this so it's completely dry. And I'm taking Simon Says Stamp Pawsitively Saturated Ink in Sage. This is a beautiful green color. And I'm very lightly dragging this ink over the raised background. Now, you could use a brayer for this like we did before, but I wanted to demonstrate you could do these techniques without a brayer. So I'm very lightly applying this ink. It takes me a while to do so because I'm so light-handed. I don't want the ink to go into the indentations of that holly pattern. I only want it on that raised background where we did the stamping. And what's cool is the white pigment ink resists that dye ink that we put on top of it. So you can see that hand-lettered look very faintly on the green, and I love the result. Now I'm heat setting that so it's completely dry, and you can see how beautiful it is. This technique works great with background stamps that are kind of have a tight print, such as text or stripes or hand lettering like this one. Next, I die cut the coordinating holly bunch die that comes with the embossing folder, and I cut that from the same craft cardstock. I left the die cut in the negative space just to hold it there, put it on my tacky mat, and now I'm covering it entirely with that same sage color cardstock. That way, this holly leaf has the same color or look as our background. But then I'm going in with the slightly darker pine ink from Simon Says Stamp and blending that towards the base and the stem of our holly bunch. This will just give a little more depth or the look of dimension. Now notice I colored my berries green. That's okay, I'll fix it later. Now I'll take this die cut and put it inside of the embossing folder. I'm placing the die cut upside down into the side of the embossing folder where the holly is pressed down. I use tape to hold it in place, and then I run it through the die cut machine, and now we have texture on that die cut. I also use the Spellbinders oval die set to create a white die cut. And I originally thought I was going to leave it plain white, but I decided to use that hand-lettered holiday stamp, and I stamped it with a very light ink. The ink color that I ended up using for this light is Pink Sand from Altenew Fresh Ink. I just thought that pulled together nicely with the craft cardstock in the background. I used a slightly larger oval die to cut from gold cardstock, and I matted that around the white. And I added it to the center of our background. And the background is on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I thought I would use the Simon Says Stamp Big Holiday Words. There are lots of sentiments in here that have coordinating dies that I could easily add to this card. I considered that, but in the end decided to go with the Simon Says Stamp CZ Design Simple Piece die. I also used the Holly Bunch embossing folder and die to create a white die cut with that embossed texture. I applied watermelon ink from Simon Says Stamp. It's a bright red, and I really applied that just to the berries. And I cut off each of those berries and I'm gluing them onto our green die cut. That way I would have a bright red instead of a red on that craft cardstock, which would dull it down a bit. I wanted it to stay bright. Another option here would be to add red gemstones or red pearls for the berries. Now I can add the holly bunch to the center of the stamped oval, and then on top of that add our piece die cut. I created that layered die cut with a white cardstock for the shadow and then gold cardstock for the word piece itself. I didn't add any sparkle or gemstones to this one. I thought it had enough going on as is, but you definitely could do so. Here you can see that stamping that we did on the raised areas of the background. And then we did a resist by putting green ink on top. Then we have our textured die cut that coordinates perfectly with the background. So this shows how you can use ink and stamping along with your embossing folders. We'll say this technique works best with embossing folders that have a lot of background space. All right, let's move on to a completely different card. This one, I show how you can use specialty inks inside of your embossing folders to add a bit of shine. So you can see the background is a mixture of an embossing folder and a die cut on top. I had a lot of fun making this one. This time I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Basket Weave 3D embossing folder. I again have craft cardstock that I'm temporarily adhering to the inside. Now on the other side of the embossing folder, I'm applying a gold metallic ink. This is Lisa Horton Gold Metallic Ink. It's part of a limited edition metallic pigment ink set. It also has silver and copper. This is a great gold pigment ink. I will link to it below. Very, very vibrant gold, but you could use any metallic ink you may have. I put ink on the raised area of that embossing folder, closed it on my cardstock, and you can see that that gold ink was pressed into the pattern. Now I want more gold, so I'll repeat that process a couple times. Now this ink is very juicy, very gold, so I only had to do it twice. If you have a different gold pigment ink, you might have to repeat it a few times to really get that gold to stand out. Now after doing that on craft cardstock, I did some overthinking and decided to switch it to white cardstock. So I'm repeating the same process with white cardstock and again the gold pigment ink. So here is a comparison between the two, just showing you the two different looks. The reason I chose to go with white in the end is because I am putting a yellow flower on it and I felt like it got lost when I had the craft background, but I'll definitely save that for a future card. Next, I have the Simon Says Stamp Double Plaid Cover Plate die. I cut that twice from white cardstock and glued it together, and now I'm gluing this on top of our embossing folder background. I love doing layers on layers of different textures. So in this case, I put die cut layer on top of an embossing folder layer. For the sentiment, I'm using the Simon Says Stamp Lovely die set and stamp set. Now the die set has the word lovely and a shadow die. That shadow die can also be used to cut out the word lovely from the stamp set, so these can be used together or separately. The stamp set also has words that work with lovely to create sentiments, such as thank you for the lovely day, you are lovely and so very loved, you're a lovely human being, so many different things here, and I love that it's a bit different than other sentiments I have. I'm also using on this card the new Simon Says Stamp Elegant Blossom Branch. I die cut this from green and yellow cardstocks and layered them together. Very easy to layer together and you get a really nice realistic look. So I added the sentiment and the die cut flower onto our layered background. Now for the sentiment, I used gold embossing powder for the UR and I used gold cardstock and white cardstock for lovely. For the flower, I also added a gold die cut at the center of the flower, and all of that gold cardstock ties in nicely with the gold ink that we used on the embossing folder that's pressed into the background. Cards like this are really fun to make where you do lots of different layers of texture on top of each other. It creates for a really special card. Next, let's do a really simple card. You can do this one very quickly and change up what you have there in the focal point. Now for this card, I used the new Simon Says Stamp Flashy Flare embossing folder. I really like this folder. Look at the amazing texture you get. Lots of different dimension. It's just beautiful. And I used, again, the Rainbow Splash Lake cardstock. Now on top of that, I'm lightly applying with a blending brush the Simon Says Stamp Positively Saturated Royal ink. Now I'm starting by putting this ink a little bit heavier in the center and then lighter around it. So this ink will get in the crevices but mostly be on the raised areas, allowing that pattern to stand out even more. For the focal point of this card, I use the new Simon Says Stamp Chelsea Butterfly die set. I'm a big fan of butterflies, especially when they're layering, so that it gives a lot of dimension. I created a butterfly out of light blue cardstock and silver cardstock and added it right into the center of our background, which is on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. The sentiment You're So Kind is from the Simon Says Stamp Just Because Sentiment Strip Pack. These are pre-printed sentiments. I just cut out the one I wanted and added it right to the center. So this card did not take much time at all, and I really think the background is what adds the most interest to it. You've got that texture with the bold color ink towards the middle, so it really draws your eye in. So adding ink with a blending brush is a quick way to really make your embossing folder backgrounds stand out. Next up, I have a pair of cards. Both use the same embossing folder and start with the same background, but they end up with two very different results based on the techniques that I used. Let's first make our backgrounds. I have a piece of light pink cardstock, and I'm applying ink to get an ombre look. I'm leaving the bottom edge of that cardstock that light pink. Above that, I'm applying a Simon Says Stamp Carnation ink, and I'm using a really soft Spellbinders large blending brush. These brushes are great for applying a soft amount of ink over a large area, so they're wonderful for doing ink blending. After applying that light carnation color, now I'm moving to a slightly darker sweets color, and I'm putting that on top of what we did, but kind of up towards the top of our cardstock piece. So I overlap it a bit. So we have the uninked light pink cardstock at the bottom, then the soft carnation ink, then we go on to the sweets, and now up here at the top, I'm doing taffy, which is darker, and I'm starting very light-handed, and I build that color. Finally, I moved to Concord and Ninth Wildberry, which is the darkest, and I put that just at the top edge. And this gives me a really easy to do ombre pink background. Now you could leave this as is, but I'm going to add embossing folder texture to it. So I have the Simon Says Stamp Falling Hearts embossing folder. I love this one. I'm putting it inside of the folder as you normally would do. So this will give us an embossed heart pattern. On our next card, we're going to do the opposite. But for this one, I'm just doing the embossing folder as we normally would. Now I'm putting a little bit of adhesive on the back of this and popping it right back in place. I'm putting it right on top of those little hearts. It pops in and fits in place. On the other side of the embossing folder, I'm applying white pigment ink. I'm kind of spreading it around and dabbing it, and I'll do this a few times. This will press white pigment ink into the background so that our hearts are a little bit darker than the background and they stand out even more. Every time I do this, the background gets softer and our hearts appear darker. So I did that 3 times, and look at this beautiful background we get. The hearts stand out even more thanks to putting that white pigment ink on the background. I do recommend heat setting this so it dries nicely. For the other card, I created the same background in the same way, but this time I am putting it on to the other side of the embossing folder. So when I close this and run it through, my hearts are pressed into the paper. Instead of standing up, they're pressed down. I'm putting this onto my tacky mat and using my Brayer and Raspberry Jam ink and gently rolling this ink on top of the raised area. And this will cause the background to be dark, and those hearts, which are pressed down or indented into the cardstock, will stay the original color. So we'll have ombre hearts with a dark background, which is opposite from the first panel we made, which is ombre hearts with a soft background. So 2 different looks, but we started with the same background and used the same embossing folder. So remember to try applying ink to both sides of your embossing folder and to apply ink to your final background on both sides. You'll get two different looks. Now for the first card, I used the Simon Says Stamp Rustic Layering Flower Set. I really like this one because you can make these flowers really full, or you can make them very thin. You can make them small, you can make them big, and there are also tiny little flowers you can create with it. I'm also using the Simon Says Stamp Grateful Floral Stamp Set and Coordinating Dies. I really like the look of the thank you sentiment, and I thought it would work well for this card. Here's our first card. This is the background where we did the ombre inking, and then we put it in the embossing folder with white pigment ink to get a softer background. I trimmed that down and added it to a white note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. I again used the Spellbinders oval die set to cut a white oval, and I used that in the same Falling Hearts embossing folder. I added that right to the center of our background and then added our pink floral die cut assembled piece along with the thank you sentiment that I stamped with taffy ink on white cardstock and cut out with the coordinating die. I like that really soft background, but you can still see that beautiful ombre look. For the second card, I used the new Just Because background stamp. This is a large background stamp that has repeated sentiments, and I really like it because it's a mix of fonts. I have always liked text backgrounds, and I like that this mixes it up a bit. I stamped that with a very light pink ink onto a white note card. Then I trimmed our other Falling Hearts background down to be narrow. I matted it on silver cardstock and added it to the center of our card. I again used the Just Because die set with white cardstock and silver cardstock and added that towards the top center. I also found a random heart die in my craft room, cut it from pink cardstock and added it to the Just Because. So in this case, we're using the opposite of the background we created before, where the background has a darker color. I also used the Just Because background stamp on the flap of my envelope so it matches perfectly. So these cards are another reminder to try adding ink to either side of your embossing folder for different looks. Okay, now for my last examples. With these, I'm applying metallic ink to the background. I'm using the new Simon Says Stamp Poinsettia Sprays 3D embossing folder. I use that on white cardstock, and I'm placing it onto my tacky mat upside down. So the raised floral print is face down and the raised background is face up towards the camera. I'm filling in those indentations of the flowers with red ink, and then I'm applying green ink over the impressed green images, so the greenery all around it. And I'm just doing a mix of green colors. You don't need to spend much time getting this blended perfectly. It's going to look like a hot mess, but I promise it'll be beautiful in the end. If you don't want to use ink, you could instead use markers to apply color those different areas. I will then heat set that so it's completely dry. Now I'm taking a gold metallic ink. This is that Lisa Horton gold metallic ink pad that is really juicy and goes on bold gold. I'm gently rubbing that and dabbing that over our background. You could use a brayer, but it's a bit faster to just go gently direct to paper. And I'm just applying this over the raised area, which in this case, because the paper is upside down, is the background. And that covers up our messy red and green that's around our image. And so we have a gold raised background and then colorful images pressed into it. You could go with a darker ink color like black, but I really like when that gold area is raised up. I wish you could see this in real life. It's really pretty. On the right is another card that I made using the same technique, but on that one, I used the Holly Bunch 3D embossing folder that I showed you earlier, but I did the exact same technique. So this works with a lot of different embossing folders. Now I do want to heat set that gold metallic ink so it doesn't smear. If you do not have a metallic ink, you could instead use a clear embossing ink over the raised background and then add gold embossing powder. Now, I originally left the tips of the poinsettias white so they would stand out, but it decided in the end I really wanted them to be solid red. So I filled in those white areas with a red marker. You could skip this if you wanted to, but I really wanted just solid red poinsettias in the end. Once I was done with the background and I was sure it was dry, I cut it at a bit of an angle towards the top for a fun card design. I also used the same embossing folder on a piece of white cardstock, and I'm gluing our gold background onto that white cardstock background. And so the pattern lines up. So the white cardstock background, the embossing is flipped over also, so the flowers are pressed down into it. I used the Simon Says Stamp CZ Design Simple Piece die set to create our sentiment. And I also added gold gemstones to the center of our 3 poinsettias and lots of red gemstones or pearls for the little berries in the background. You could have done less of those if you wanted to, but I really liked all of that red dimension. And remember, even though I put gold metallic ink over that background, you could instead use any darker color ink, like I did on the Falling Hearts background before. Now here is another card I made off screen. This I used the same technique, but I used that Holly Bunch embossing folder and the coordinating die. I just wanted to show another example. I like the poinsettia one better, but I thought I'd share this too. All right, there you have lots of ways to use your embossing folders, particularly the 3D embossing folders that are really popular right now. I again will link at the end of this video to my embossing folder playlist if you're looking for more ideas. I have a link to all of the products I used in my description below if you would like to check that out. I thank you for spending this time with me. I know that my videos are longer, but I'm hoping you learn a thing or two while watching them. Have a good day, and we'll see you soon.